Good afternoon, everybody. We begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional, the ancestral, and the unceded territory of the 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙤speaking Migr people. This has been a place of teaching, a place of learning, and a place of community since time immemorial. And today we're coming together as a research center and the broader university community. And as we do so, we also recognize the accountability that we have as uninvited guests on this territory, our accountability toward the land and its first peoples. And that includes, in my own thinking, for us to think about and reflect about what it is that we do on this land. What do we contribute to larger society through our work, through our research? How do we question and change colonial mindsets that many of us were raised within? That's a hard one. How do we reflect and recognize the larger structures of racism, of colonialism, and inequality that we're all embedded in? My name is Antje Ellermann, and I'm the co-director of the Center for Migration Studies. And I'm really deeply grateful to the entire CMS team for making this event possible. So I want to start out with some thank yous. I want to thank 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙦𝙯𝙖𝙩𝙞𝙬 and 𝙍𝙖𝙬𝙚𝙦𝙪𝙗𝙗, who have meticulously planned this entire event, and I know are working hard today. On the day, I want to thank our graduate academic assistants who are supporting us, 𝙈𝙤𝙬𝙬 Bhattacharjee over there, and then Fiona Kawani. Oh, she just stepped out, for all their logistical support that is so necessary to make this happen. I want to also thank Marie Frileux. Marie, where are you? In the very back, she's been taking your name, for her communications work and making sure we have a full room today. And we also, I should say, have a pretty full Zoom room on top of it all. So thank you for everybody who's helped to make this event happen. It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody, lots of old faces and lots of new faces. In the beginning of the term, I always love this time of year when we're just full of energy and full of anticipation of what the new year, the new academic year has to bring. And this is the first event in our CMS speaker series for 2024-25. The series is titled Migration, Racialization, and Inequality. And we're going to really devote this year to really systematically and sustainably think about that intersection of those three terms. And I think that can take many forms. It is questions like recognizing the way in which migration reflects structural inequalities and injustices, globally speaking. It's thinking about the role of immigration policy in entrenching these inequalities and divisions. And it also is the recognition that the experience of migration itself is a deeply racialized experience. So I look forward to having the opportunity to learn and to talk and hopefully to be in a different place at the end of this year in terms of my own understanding of those intersections. Now, before we move toward introducing our speakers, there's some other introductions. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce the new CMS co-director, Irene Blumrath, to you all in person. I know you've seen the communications. Irene joined us here from UC Berkeley, is now the President's Excellence Chair in Global Migration. And we worked very hard to convince her to come here, and somehow we succeeded. And I'm really, really excited about all the things that I already know that she will bring to this leadership work and to this community that CMS is. So please join me in welcoming Irene Blumrath.
Greetings, everybody. Hello. I don't like doing endless introductions because that's a little bit boring because you all came here to listen to Andrew. But I just wanted to welcome you all in person. So especially for those of you who are in the room right now, thank you so much for coming to our first speaker event. For those of you on Zoom, I still haven't met you in person, but do reach out because I would love to meet you in person. We are going to continue this year at the Center for Migration Studies, building on a lot of the strengths that has made CMS so important on the UBC campus and beyond. So we're going to continue the interdisciplinarity, the engagement with community organizations, the commitment to decolonization. We're going to have our speaker series as we've had in previous years, and as you've heard from 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤, what the theme is this year. We're going to continue with the research clusters, which I think are sort of the vibrant heart and sort of base of a lot of what we're doing in bringing people together around themes that animate migration studies. But we're also doing a lot of exciting, cool things this year that we're starting to build. So this is our very first year of the Certificate for Migration Studies. And so for any of you who are graduate students in the audience, if you are interested in the Certificate for Migration Studies and want to learn more, come speak to us, look up on the web and you'll find more information. For those of you who supervise grad students, please let them know about this. And especially if you are encouraging would-be grad students to come to UBC, let them know about the certificate, because I really think this makes UBC stand out among universities, I would say worldwide, in giving sort of an extra interdisciplinary migration mobilities focused element to your research, your grad research. And as I said, this is really interdisciplinary. So you can be in the humanities, you can be in the social sciences, you can be in the professional schools. We welcome you. Another thing that we're going to be building is a research brief series, and we're going to really try to highlight the great work that's being done at UBC and at CMS by our affiliates. And so I've been working closely with Migr and with others at the Center for Migration Studies. And so we hope to amplify further the work that's being done. If any of you have suggestions, things that you would like to see the center take on, please reach out to us. We're always looking for great ideas. We're always looking for partners to engage. So consider this an open invitation, again, to the people in the room, but also the people I cannot see, but who are on Zoom. All right, I'm going to now hand the mic over to another newcomer to the campus. This is Professor Terry Givens. We are absolutely delighted that Terry is joining us at the Center for Migration Studies and in the Department of Political Science. We managed to recruit Terry from McGill, and then previous to that, she was in the United States. Some of you who do comparative politics might know her work on comparative politics in the European context, anti-immigrant parties, the rise of racism, or the continued amplification of racism in the European context. Terry's also has a very long and distinguished history in terms of being a campus administrator, working on a lot of DEI initiatives. And so it's a real thrill to be able to come to UBC, not just to join 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤 and the center, but also to join Terry here. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Terry, who's going to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you so much. And I'll just mention that my work, I'm getting out of administration finally. And so my work is going to be focused on the intersections of migration and race here at UBC. And so I'm really excited to have Andrew here because he is actually going to be a part of that, I hope, as we go forward. And I forgot my speaker notes, of course, because I have some things I have to announce. But in any case, I'm, as Irene mentioned, somebody who's been doing this work for a long time. Actually, I've known 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤 and Irene for a long time. We've all been part of this milieu of the study of migration and race. And the interesting thing in political science, sociology has been way ahead of political science in terms of the study of immigration and migration politics. And pretty much political science has been trying to catch up for the last 20 or 30 years or so. We've had folks who have been doing the work who kind of mentored myself and Irene and 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤 and others who we're celebrating recently at our American Political Science Association meeting. But really, we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's going on around the intersections of migration and race. And so I was really excited to discover Andrew's work, and we're really hoping that we can build on that as we go forward. So I'm going to mention that hybrid and online events can be tricky to host. So we would like to thank you in advance if there are any technical difficulties, especially to the folks online. If you have any questions or clarifications, you'll be given an opportunity to ask them during the Q&A. So we will ask you to just hold your questions until after the presentation. For those of you who are joining us online, please use the Q&A function for your questions. CMS Research Manager 𝙍𝙬𝙚𝙦𝙯𝙩 will be posting instructions in the chat and moderating the Q&A for those who are joining us online. So next, Andrew. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Florida. His research examines racial inequality and international migration, global racial inequality and dependency, and international order. His first book, Undesirable Immigrants, Why Racism Persists in International Migration, won an award from the APSA Race, Ethnicity and Politics section. His work has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Peace Research, Review of International Studies, and Security Dialogue, among other outlets. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from the Ohio State University. So thanks a lot, Andrew, and please help me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here in Vancouver at UBC. I just want to this is sort of a parade of thank yous, but I really want to thank Irene, Antje, Terry at MAZA, and everybody else who's been involved with putting this speaker series together and who's responsible for me even being here. It's, again, truly, truly a privilege. And like Terry said, I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida. And I guess for all the students who are out there, this slide here is a real opportunity for you to understand that just because somebody has tenure doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes. So, so I guess this is also an invitation to always speak truth to power. And like we heard, the majority of my work uses quantitative techniques to unmask the persistence of racial inequality in international politics. And the funny thing about that is that a lot of what I do is try to amass large-scale evidence of things that many people in this room may have intuitions about in their head. And so what I try to do is provide a variety of types of evidence to that score. So I always like to begin talks with a spoiler alert. So we're going to talk about two things today. Toward that end, the first thing I'm going to show you, again, one of those things we may already know something about, but I'm going to provide evidence that non-white refugees provoke both an attitudinal and a policy backlash in states of the global north. And then as a broader point, I want to transition into perhaps having a broader discussion about about what this might tell us about the nature of racial inequality and dependence in the contemporary international order. And to do that, what I'm going to do is take the opportunity to discuss a paper in progress. So this is unpublished work, so any advice or feedback or questions you may have about it will be really, really welcome. And this working paper is sort of really exemplifies the type of work that I do through a poignant contemporary example, which is the contrasting welcome that refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine and refugees fleeing the war in Syria experienced in Europe. So infamously, countries in Europe that have been reluctant to welcome asylum seekers from Syria have been more than willing to open their arms to those from Ukraine. And for instance, the Bulgarian prime minister discussed how those fleeing Ukraine were professionals, Europeans, Christians, and those fleeing Syria were sort of terrorists or otherwise undesirable or dangerous. Now, as we all know, that this has generated calls by many or accusations by many that this reflects a racialized hypocrisy on the part of both the leaders and the publics in Europe and indeed throughout the global north in general. And so in this project, I ask whether in fact it is racial bias that explains this divergence in response. And to put a finer point on these questions, I ask whether non-white refugees do in fact provoke a migration policy backlash in the global north, and whether white refugees actually provoke the opposite, like we might expect that they have looking at the case of Ukraine. So there's a debate over this, which may seem a bit counterintuitive to some, but on the one hand, some folks would say that, well, obviously racial bias drives these different policy responses. We see that countries in the global north increased the restrictions during the Syrian so-called migrant crisis, but relaxed them in 2022 and beyond. This relates to work in this area that shows that perceived racial threat is associated with anti-migrant attitudes, and that exposure to Middle Eastern refugees triggers support for anti-migrant policies, attitudes, and parties. Moreover, we also know that survey respondents exhibit anti-Muslim racism in their refugee attitudes. And there's a whole litany of qualitative studies and critical race theory work that supports these conclusions in a variety of ways. However, on the other hand, others would make the argument that no, in fact, this divergence just reflects a bias towards all outsiders, irrespective of their race. That any migrants and refugees provoke restrictive policies, and that what we're seeing here is just variation in prejudiced attitudes towards all outsiders, and that race really doesn't have anything to do with it. And instead, what we're seeing here is just the instantiation of principled concerns over things like fiscal costs, wages, and integration, concerns about education and skill level, not race, as well as other foreign policy considerations. So it's not race, it's just a generalized preference for insiders versus outsiders. So unsurprisingly, in this project, I argue in favor of the racial bias argument. I make the claim that actually non-white arrivals, not just arrivals, but arrivals, trigger perceptions of undesirability. But the issue here is that this undesirability is bound up with these so-called principal concerns. But most importantly, that race and racial difference is correlated with these concerns. And that histories of racism and global white supremacy caused these objectively neutral conditions that we now securitize or describe as obviously or objectively undesirable. And this is closely related to the argument that I make in my book. And I mean, I know that Christmas is right around the corner. And I would just encourage you, for those loved ones in your life who love social science, that it reads great in hardback and in softback. So whatever strikes your fancy. But this argument is related to the argument that I make in this book. And importantly, what I do in this project and in other projects is draw on the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon and others who make similar claims over 100 years ago. So what I'm going to show you is an excerpt from W.E.B. Du Bois's The African Roots of War. It's this amazing article that he wrote in The Atlantic magazine. And the really interesting thing about it is that he makes an argument about the origins of World War I that are very, very, very similar to the argument that Lenin makes in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, a year later. But until very recently, Du Bois never got the credit for this, and Lenin, for, probably a lot of several reasons that we could speculate about, gets all the credit. But in the African Roots of War, he talks about how Africa was, quote, furiously mangled by the slave trade. And what that did was leave the continent in a condition of helplessness that invited later exploitation. So we saw the slave trade produce these conditions in Africa that the colonizers later used as an objective, in inverted commas or quotation marks, objective rationale for everything that came later. So the argument that I'm making in this project and in other projects is not from me. I'm drawing on this work of Du Bois and others. I just wanted to emphasize that. Importantly, particularly in contemporary politics, we know that leaders throughout the global north both respond to and amplify the public's racial biases, which makes this intractable, or at least a very difficult position if we're thinking about politics moving forward. The issue with testing the racial bias argument, though, is that it's really hard. We have several inferential challenges that crop up irrespective of how you want to study race, racial bias, and racial inequality in international politics and in migration. The first relates to how race is constructed in the international system. And this affects you whether you do qualitative, historical, interpretive work or quantitative work. It's just the case that different countries have different racial ontologies or categories. And it's really difficult to imagine how to do comparisons either across space and across time. And if we're thinking about doing case studies to support our arguments, it's really easy to choose cases that conform with the logic of our theories and don't engage with this fundamental issue. Secondly, plenty of folks have tried to use survey experiments to study things that are related to this, and they benefit from experimental control, but they have issues with external validity because they prompt respondents to think about either hypothetical migrants, hypothetical groups, or something that may be internally valid, but perhaps not externally valid. Natural experiments, like those that show the effect of a given refugee crisis on attitudes or behavior. But what they cannot do is compare different crises, because if I knew when a crisis was going to happen, then I'd be omniscient and I wouldn't be a professor. Like I would be, won the lottery and doing something else. Moreover, there are other studies that show that states enact restrictions during refugee crises. But what studies don't do is test the effect of different origins on the propensity to enact those restrictions. So what I do is I conduct two tests of the racial bias argument that are both totally imperfect, but hopefully taken together provide some evidence on this score. And what it does, or what I do, is I combine the strength of two methods. I use a survey that leverages quasi-random exposure to the 2015 and the 2022 refugee crises, as well as cross-national data. And in the first test, I look at European policy attitudes both before and after the peak of both of these crises. And I look at the cross-national level and look whether there's an association between non-white refugee and asylum seeker arrivals and restrictive policies. We have some expectations that arise out of the racial bias argument. In our first test, given what we know about the politics on the ground, we might expect that folks that were surveyed after the peak of the 2015 crisis may have more restrictive policy attitudes, and that those that were surveyed after the peak of the 2022 crisis may have more permissive attitudes. In the second test, again, very simply, we might expect that non-white refugees provoke more restrictive policies, and the opposite for white refugees. However, I also want us to think about an important mechanism, which is the role of individual media consumption. And what media consumption can do, and I think we all have some intuition about this, is that media coverage can reinforce or challenge these racial biases that are disseminated throughout sort of the popular zeitgeist. And if you've just watched basically any TV or consumed any political news, you know what we're talking about. So this is an example of CNN, sort of a center-left news source in the United States, and how they covered a so-called migrant surge at the American southern border. And it's contrasted with how similar center-left news sources covered the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the refugee so-called crisis that emerged out of that. And we see the parroting of these racialized discourses in both. And we might expect that these mechanism affects respondents who consume more political news, which generates a further expectation that political media coverage moderates the effect of refugee arrivals on public attitudes. So I'm going to show some evidence on this as well. So let's talk about that first test. What I do in this analysis is I use the 7th and the 10th wave of the European Social Survey, which is really useful for this purpose because respondents were surveyed before, during, and after the peak of both the 2015 and the 2022 refugee crises. And what I do in this analysis is what's called a regression discontinuity in time design, which is a mouthful, but it's actually quite straightforward in its logic. All we're doing is we're comparing people who were surveyed just before the peak of the crisis and just after the peak of the crisis to see if there are differences between those groups. And that crisis cutoff in the 2022 case is relatively straightforward. It's the date of the Russian invasion, the 24th of February, 2022. However, in 2015, the case is not so straightforward. When did the crisis happen? When did the peak of the crisis happen? This is a really strong assumption that we have to make here. So there's a variety of choices. The one that I made was the 2nd of September 2015, which was the death of Aylan Kurdi in Turkey. And this death was associated with an image that was circulated around the globe. And what it did was dramatically increase attention, both in Europe and worldwide, on this crisis. And it even affected the 2015 Canadian federal election. Some of you may remember this actually occurring. I think Justin Trudeau said that you don't get to selectively have empathy or sympathy, something to that effect. There's a lot of really interesting work on this effect, how this affected the election. And so in this case, the treatment group, the people who we say are exposed to the peak of the crisis, were those who were surveyed after the 1st of September 2015. And what I can do is show you, this is Google search data, and that vertical line is the 1st of September 2015. And we can see that after that date, there was a dramatic increase in the number of people who were searching about refugees in basically every global north country. So like I said, the goal of this analysis is to compare people just before and just after these cutoffs. And what that simulates is as if random selection into being surveyed just before or just after these cutoffs. And so what we're assuming here is that there are no differences between the people who were surveyed just before and just after, other than the fact that some just so happen to be surveyed just after. And what we have to do is choose what's called a bandwidth around that cutoff. Like, how many people are we going to include in this analysis in order to make that assumption that the people just before the cutoff look the same as those people just after the cutoff, other than the fact that some were surveyed before and after the cutoff. And this is important because smaller bandwidths are more credible in terms of this assumption. But larger bandwidths mean we have more statistical power to detect an effect if one exists. Because if we have a larger bandwidth, it means we have more data. And when you have more data, you have more power to detect an effect should it exist. And so I use 3, 5, and 7 days, and the results are the same across all 3 of these. But I'm just going to show you the 3-day results because I think they're the most credible. So the dependent variable I use, in 2015, I'm using the question of whether or not these respondents want their country to allow immigrants from a different racial group. And in 2022, I asked them, or I used the question of whether they think their country should allow fewer immigrants from the same racial group. And it's a question, it's a 4-point scale, allow none to allow many. And I use something called an ordinal logistic regression. But what this allows me to do is estimate each crisis's impact on the probability of a certain response. For instance, I'm able to say that I estimate that the 2015 crisis made respondents X% more likely to support accepting many immigrants from a different racial group, or fewer immigrants from a different racial group. It allows me to make and estimate these types of changes in probabilities. So let's look at the results. I'm going to show you the 2015 results first, and then the 2022 results. And there's going to be some really interesting differences across them. So here are the results in 2015. So respondents who were surveyed after the 1st of September 2015 are over 20% more likely to want their country to accept no immigrants from different racial groups, and roughly 20% less likely to allow their country to accept some immigrants from different racial groups. And that allow many result is significant at the 10% level, but it's also a negative effect. So with respect to the 2015 crisis, we see evidence that's consistent with the argument's expectations. But something interesting happens in 2022. The model estimates a pretty sharp null effect with a little bit of uncertainty around that allow many category. And this raises all sorts of interesting questions, but I think it does reflect something about what we know about the politics on the ground. In 2022, populist and right-wing parties and advocacy groups had already had the experience of 2015, and they were already armed with sort of counter narratives in order to sort of combat some of the narratives that existed in 2015. And I think we see this in some existing work on this, which shows that there was an initial brief spike in willingness to accept migrants and refugees that quickly sort of fell back down. And that's not work that I've done, but I think talking to others, this is consistent with what we find in those cases as well. So let's talk very briefly about the moderating effect of media consumption. So we expect that people that consume more political news are going to have stronger effects here. And in the 2015 case, that's exactly what we found. Sorry that that's like sort of washed out a little bit. I should have made that a little bit darker. But what we see here is that folks who consume very little political news basically have no effect of the 2015 crisis. But those who consume just under an average amount of news and more have a much stronger significant effect of the 2015 crisis on their negative attitudes towards migrants and refugees of a different race. And in 2022, it's a little bit more muddled. And I know you can't really see the uncertainty that well, but there's some some humble evidence that folks who consume a lot of political news are actually more receptive towards their country accepting immigrants from the same racial group. But I don't really know what to make of the 2022 case. Let's talk about the second test now, which just simply asks whether non-white refugees are associated with more restrictive policies in countries of the global north. In this analysis, the unit of analysis is the destination state year, but it's only looking at global north countries. And the dependent variable is just the number of restrictive migration policies that that country enacts in a given year. And the main independent variable in this analysis is either the non-white or the white refugee arrivals. So what is that? What is that main independent variable? The thing that we think is doing the causal work here? Well, this must be estimated. And so what I do to estimate this is I leverage the ethnic power relations and the ethnic dimensions data sets to calculate the proportion of each origin state's population with European and non-European ancestry. And then I multiply the number of arrivals from that origin state by that origin's proportion non-white. And in this case, arrivals means asylum applications and prima facie arrivals. And what I do is I sum over all of the origin states, which gives me an estimate of, for each global north country, how many non-white refugees arrived in that country in a given year. And I can calculate the number of white refugees that arrived using the exact same method, just switching the thing that I'm multiplying here. So these are ordinary least squares regressions, but the important thing to note here is that I also control for both the economic and foreign policy objective considerations that you think might be at play here. I control for the average GDP of a global north state's origin states, which is a little bit convoluted to wrap your head around. But I also control for the refugee flows from a state's allies. So again, these are imperfect ways of controlling for these alternative expectations, but we would expect that these would capture something about the economic and the foreign policy arguments here. I also control for other stuff, like an origin state's level of democracy, GDP, population, conflict, and so on and so forth. Happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if anybody wishes. So let's look at the association here, and I know it's a bit of a leading figure because there's a lot of space above zero and not very much space below zero. But when I look at the association between all refugee arrivals and the number of restrictive policies, we see that refugee arrivals are associated with an increase in the number of expected restrictive migration policies. Now let's look at differences between non-white and white arrivals. Non-white refugee arrivals, a 1 standard deviation increase in those arrivals is associated with just under 2 restrictive policy enactments in a given year, which is substantively a lot, given that the modal number of restrictive policies that are enacted in a year is 0. However, when we look at white refugee arrivals, we estimate no effect on restrictiveness. So let's summarize these results very briefly. We show that non-white refugees provoke migration restrictions and restrictive attitudes, while white refugees do not, and that this pattern is consistent with individual level results, as well as what we know from existing work in this area. It's also corroborated, I think, by what we know about the politics on the ground in both of these cases. There's also a lot of important limitations to this work that I just want to note. And I think, for the students in the audience, this may give you an opportunity to, tell me I'm wrong or to go do something better. So of course, case selection is an important issue here, right? For instance, isn't it really that foreign policy considerations drive the 2022 results? Maybe that's why we see those nulls or something. And there's also perhaps systematic differences between the folks who are arriving in Europe in the two cases, which is surely the case. There's also plenty of issues to raise with the discontinuity in 2015. Aren't there other sort of breaks throughout the so-called crisis that may affect attitudes? Maybe it shouldn't be the 2nd of September. Maybe it should be some other time. And obviously, as with any unidentified cross-sectional analysis, there's certainly some unaddressed endogeneity going on here. And so that's why I wanted to take this opportunity while I had this soapbox to basically say that any researcher doing any type of social science, in addition to social science on these really sort of pressing and important political issues, need to not only be humble, but also to be flexible and creative when they think about how to actually study this stuff that's really difficult and sensitive to study. So I'm going to wrap up with a few conclusions, and some conclusions maybe for a broader discussion if we have time. Despite these limitations, I think the results are quite clear, even with a little bit of a twist. And they're significant, these conclusions or these results, given the expected increase that we should see in climate migration from the global south. Because if you look in this area, that the countries that are going to be most affected by the global climate crisis are going to be those countries that are racialized as non-white or undesirable in a variety of degrees. So this seems perhaps a bit untractable given the world that we might expect to be living in the coming decades. And pessimistically, one may make the argument that this backlash to non-white migrants and refugees in the global north may produce a climate fortress global north, which may increase the burden of caring for these folks on the already precarious states of the global south. And to put a broader point on this, we may expect to see an increase in global inequality, precarity, violence, and populism for that matter. And my new book project engages with a lot of these issues. It builds on my work in international migration to think bigger about how this fits in to the general crises of the 21st century. But when you leave here today and you think about the things that I talked about, you may think about, I don't know, a couple of the errors on some of the slides, or at least that's what I'll be thinking about. But what I want you to remember is that race, racial bias, racial inequality, these aren't just things that take place within states like Canada, the United States, France, and so on. These are racial phenomena. I'm going to think about that too. This is a global phenomenon. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
So you ended on one of my favorite topics these days, which my book, so if you want to look at another book that talks about this stuff, is my book, The Roots of Racism, which looks at this more from a transatlantic perspective and ideas, but very much ties into what Andrew is looking at. So we'll have the Q&A now, and I want to let you know that, again, we're in a hybrid situation, so we'll do a couple questions from the audience, and then we'll see if there's questions online. And let me see if there's anything else I'm supposed to say here. Yes, so please raise your hand and wait for the microphone before talking so everybody can hear you. And please introduce yourself with your name and if you're in a department here before asking your question. So thanks. We have a first question out there. Here.
My name's sorry. My name's Katie McConnell. I'm coming from the sociology department. I spend a lot of time thinking about climate and migration internal to the US. But as I've been watching sort of politics leading up to the American election, it sort of makes me think about a piece of your work and whether, like, nearness to election may be a moderator of the impacts on policy restrictiveness. And it doesn't sound like you've looked at that, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think that would be a mediating factor.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something that I've been thinking about as well. And you're right, I don't address that directly, but it's probably, it probably has something to do with this media consumption mechanism that I'm talking about, just because, I mean, the United States is a bit of a weird case because we sort of are always in an election cycle. It's not like Canada or the United Kingdom where they have like very defined periods of elections, right? And I think that's why I've been thinking more about consumption of media. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head. It's difficult. I'm trying to think about how to integrate this really good and really apt suggestion. So something that I've been thinking about is how to take advantage of county level or media market level media information that like my colleagues in American politics have used to study other stuff. And that may provide a way to do that, because like if your media market is totally captured by Sinclair, which is a right-wing conglomerate that owns a lot of media in the United States, like that may be activated the closer you get to an election. So if you live in a county that is captured by Sinclair and you're close to an election, we should expect to see more extreme results or more your stronger results. So it gives me a lot of food for that, but I think you're exactly spot on, because there's certainly something going on there.
And I can always throw in another point, which there's a great article somebody did a few years, in the early 2000s about issue salience and the connection to immigration controls. So I'll share that with you later.
Yeah, no, I think I cite it in the paper.
Okay, yeah. But I think the issue salience is what we're getting at. And the underlying issue is like, how much is it being, talked about in the media versus, times when there are other issues that are more focused on. But anyway, yes. We had one here first. Right here in the gray. And then we'll go, are there?
Hi, thanks for your presentation, Andrew. Julie Ham from Brock University, visiting the Center for Migration Studies this term. I was wondering, I had a couple of questions. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your survey sample. I'm assuming based on the way the questions were phrased, would you support immigrants from a different racial group coming in or something like that? So I'm assuming that means that the sample was white, that a criteria was whiteness to participate in the sample, because for an Asian participant from a different racial group could mean someone who's white. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that. And then second, when I was listening to your presentation, I was also considering the extent to which the term refugee, the extent to which the category refugee becomes racialized in itself. And so even though we are aware of refugee as an administrative label, but for people who are exposed to particular media representations, this category just becomes linked with non-whiteness. And so where there is, I'm wondering if there's this kind of like, if we're thinking about racial bias and thinking that through, whether there's some sort of like mental block or mental gymnastics where if they see the term, like even it's about kind of sensing that a term, intuiting the term white refugee for some people may be an oxymoron. And it comes through in the way that, or I think it comes through in the way that Ukrainian refugees were discussed. It's kind of like there's this unspoken sense, or sometimes spoken, of like, well, they're not like refugees, right? They're people caught in a bad situation. And so I'm wondering how that kind of cognitive gymnastics could be captured in a quantitative method. Thanks.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So in the survey, I select on natives. And so I select on natives and on sort of ethnic identity. And so I'm looking at sort of the putative white natives of these countries. And so I sort of do it with only those folks, as well as the entire sample of people. And I control for all of these things. But interestingly, I lost my train. Oh, yeah. And so the results are consistent in both cases, but I think it's an interesting question of who we should be asking these questions of, because I think there is some evidence that folks who live in global north countries who aren't ascriptively white still become imbued with these racialized stereotypes of the other. And so that's kind of beyond the scope of this project, but I think it sort of relates to some of those really important conversations that are happening in related disciplines. The second question about sort of the term refugee, I mean, it reminds me of Rebecca Hamlin's book, actually, and how this category becomes linked with these certain racialized representations. I think you're exactly right, and it reminds me of the conversation that Irene and I were having before the talk. We were discussing about like what people are thinking about when they're thinking about what a white undocumented migrant is and where they're coming from. And this is these are really important considerations if we're thinking about how to design interventions in order to make people more receptive, right? And so I guess I have two further sort of qualified answers to that. So the first thing that's important to note is that in the survey, they're not seeing the word refugee. They're seeing the word migrant, which I think suffers from the same issue, but I think is perhaps a little bit less loaded. But the second thing is that you're totally right. And I think this is an area that is sort of ripe for exploration, because as we were talking about, if what policymakers and advocacy groups are trying to do is trying to move the needle on these issues, we need to amass some large-scale evidence about how word choice affects sort of average people's and average citizens' receptiveness to certain policies and policy proposals. And so I think sort of the quantitative way to approach that would be via some suite of survey experiments or focus groups or something like that to really try to subject to social desirability bias, but to get some leverage on what folks are actually thinking and how the choice of words that we use really impacts the ultimate results. Thank you so much for your questions. They're going to give me a lot to think about.
Okay, now we have a question from our online audience. This is from Murdoch Stevens. They say, thank you for a fascinating talk. And in their own work, the counterfactual that they always look towards the predominance of DRC resettlement during the Trump years. Obviously, you are speaking of correlation, asylum, and public attitudes in European states. But do you have any response to that counterfactual other than centrality of religion, or perhaps elaborating on that?
So that's a super interesting point, and it relates to some other work that I have, which is focused on the United States. So in the United States, I have county-level refugee resettlement data by origin, and I think it speaks to the possibility of being able to answer questions like this. Could you please repeat the second part of the question, just so I can make sure
Sure.
I give it its proper attention?
Yeah, they noted you're speaking of correlation, asylum, and public attitudes in European states, but do you have a response to that counterfactual? Or I'm sorry, the counterfactual that they reference is the predominance of DRC resettlement during the Trump years.
Yeah.
And I think they're asking if you have a response to that besides the centrality of religion,
Yeah.
or if there's something else in there you'd like to elaborate on.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful about talking about this resettlement because this resettlement during the Trump years, because I'm not an expert in this particular policy of the Trump administration. But what I'm interested in is, irrespective of where that resettlement comes from, because we know during the Trump years that there was a dramatic decrease in refugee admissions, right? And so I don't know why this was perhaps a greater proportion than we would expect of refugee resettlements. But what I am interested in is what the effect is of those resettlements on public attitudes. And without saying where those resettlements come from, it's important, I think, to think about the local effects of those resettlements on attitudes, because, you know, the contact hypothesis might suggest that it could be a good thing, but the arguments against the contact hypothesis would suggest that it would be a bad thing. And I think that's just an empirical question. So without speculating too much on this really great question, I wrote it down. It's something that I'm going to think about. So thank you, Murdoch. Wherever you are out there in cyberspace. Thanks, and please feel free to follow up because this is, I think, a really important concern.
Yeah, I would add that the situation, the very unfortunate situation in Springfield, Ohio, is an example of how complex this is. You have a city that was very welcoming, but then the issue becomes salient, and then, you know, for various reasons, and it causes all kinds of havoc. But in any case, do we have other questions out there? So maybe you'll start in the back in the blue shirt. That's you.
Hey, Will Chan, friend of the speaker. Just a quick question on the data about the 2022 crisis. I think because a lot of the allied states of Ukraine or European and view the Russians as maybe a perpetual antagonist or whatever. If you pull back the data, or is there a subset of the data that you use that would suggest a different conclusion on the receptivity towards, you know, non or white migrants or refugees?
Yeah. So in this analysis, thanks. Will and I went to university together a long time ago, so it's great to see him. So that's a really good question. So this actually speaks to the important inferential issue here, which is how do we balance sort of the credibility of the results in a causal sense with perhaps dealing with some other dynamics that were actually taking place during this period. So if you look at only using 3 days around the cutoff, or 5 days around the cutoff, or 7 days around the cutoff, we see this really strong null. But if you broaden the cutoff further to 10, 12, 15 days around the cutoff, where our assumption that the groups of people before and after the cutoff are the same, other than the fact that the people after the cutoff just so happened to be surveyed after the Russian invasion, the bigger you make that, the stronger the results in favor of what I suggest we should find, which is that people who were surveyed after the Russian invasion should be more likely to want to their country to accept migrants and refugees. The problem with that is that we're running up against the assumptions we have to make in order for the causal interpretation to carry through. And so what I didn't want to do was sort of cherry pick the size of my bandwidth in order to get the results that conform with what my theoretical expectations suggest. And so I stuck as faithfully as possible to the principles that will allow me, I think, to make the most defendable conclusions. However, if you do expand the sample beyond that sort of small group of people, we do reach a different conclusion, but I just don't know how credible that conclusion is given the assumptions that we need to make in order to make a causal interpretation here. Thanks so much for the question.
And then what here in the gray and orange?
Hi, I'm Sandra Shinnerl with the Center for Migration Studies. I was hoping you could say something more about policy change as an indicator of anti-immigrant sentiment and how you measured that. Was it a legislative change? Was it a regulatory change? How wide the scope of the policy change did you define? And I'm also really curious because right smack dab in the middle of your 2015 and 2022, you've got COVID. And there's lots of things happening in terms of keeping people out that are different than necessarily thinking about migration. It's actually the movement of people because of health reasons as opposed to settlement. And whether you thought or mitigated that in any way.
Yeah, fabulous question. So I'll take the first one first, I suppose. So policy change as an indicator. So the determinants of international migration, so the DMIG project at Oxford. So they have this data on migration policy changes, and it runs the gamut. So legislative, regulatory, minor, major, and a variety of policy categories. So legal entry and stay, integration, deportation, and so on. So what I do is I use only those that they deem to be major national level changes. The results actually hold if you pool all of the results. So I think that's actually kind of interesting as well. But in a sort of supplementary analysis, what I do is I break apart those different policy categories, and I look to see whether this association is stronger or strongest for one of those types of policy categories versus the other. And don't quote me on this because I'm not 100% sure I'm recalling, but I'm almost positive that we see the strongest effects on legal entry and stay, as well as I believe it's for sure legal entry and stay. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But I ran out of space in this paper to include this disaggregation by policy outcome. But whatever it was that I found, it was, I think, really illustrative of what the mechanism is. And I just kind of took it out because I think it's a different paper, but it's something that I've thought about. So thank you so much for raising the issue. Yeah, COVID happened. That's true. And woof. So of course, there were a lot of border closures and policy changes that were putatively associated with public health versus some of the things that I'm talking about in this talk. There was a really interesting special issue of the International Relations Journal International Organization that I think speaks to some of these issues and maybe raises the question of whether it was in fact some of these issues that I raise in this talk that maybe provided countries cover to enact the type of long-standing restrictions that they kind of wanted to do anyway. That's a pretty difficult empirical nut to crack, but I think there is perhaps some suggestive evidence of that. But I think from a technically speaking, what COVID does is make it very difficult to compare across the two sets of results. So I don't know, if you're somebody who considers yourself like really math or numbers phobic, like maybe put your earmuffs on. So there's this thing called a seemingly unrelated regression that would allow me to like compare those two results across each other. But you have to make the assumption that you have to make a variety of assumptions that are related with the sort of underlying conditions and the underlying data generating process. And I think it makes it less likely that we can actually do that in a credible sense. I think you're right. I don't know what to make of it or whether that would actually lead to the nulls that I find. But from the politics on the ground, it's certainly the case. But I think my strong positive argument would be that these things that I'm talking about are also bound up in that. It just is sort of a bit more covert. Thank you, though.
Yeah, I think it's a yes and story.
Yeah, right, of course.
And
my favorite type of story.
Well, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
And you can see that there were policy outcomes that happened during COVID that were just carried forward. And anyway, we can talk about that a lot. Lots of hands up. Well, since you're back there, I think Alan, did you still want to ask your question or?
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting talk, Andrew. I'm Alan Jacobs in the Political Science Department.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi. So my question, maybe it's a little slightly in the weeds, but it's about the dependent variable you chose for the first part of the study, the ESS question. I'm wondering if you could maybe say a bit about sort of the strengths. So if I understood correctly, you used a question that asks whether people support or oppose migration by people of other races.
or similar in the case of 2022.
A similar question.
Also, in 2015.
Or similar races.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. So part of your answer could be that I'm just a little confused about how that operates, but I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit to the sort of advantages or possibly limitations of using a question that directs respondents to be thinking about race. So one sort of slightly different research design might be to, involve asking just generally, about attitudes toward admitting more or fewer immigrants, and then ask how the sort of racial composition of the immigrant flow at that period of time predicts overall support or opposition to immigration, in some sense, allowing respondents to sort of draw the connection in their heads, right?
Yeah.
And sort of allowing us to ask whether they do draw that connection, right? Rather than having it suggested by the question. So if you could say, but I realize your choices in the ESS questionnaire may have been limited, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about the sort of pros and cons of that choice.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's really, really important question. And in fact, the 2 times that I've submitted this paper, hint, hint, I think the bulk, I've gotten some folks who I think are the folks who have pushed back, we'll say in a kind way, have been pushing back because of the original choice of the DV. So what I needed was questions that were comparable in the 7th wave and in the 10th wave. Don't quote me on this. I haven't worked on this project specifically in like 4 months, but in the 7th and the 10th wave, there isn't just a general question about accepting immigrants. There's a few choices. There's accepting immigrants from racially different, racially similar groups, as well as willingness to accept immigrants from poor countries from outside Europe. So I started this project many moons ago by using that question about whether or not they would would they want their country to accept more immigrants from poor countries from outside Europe, because I think that gets closest to what you're talking about here, not priming them to think about race, but just having them think about immigrants. But of course, poor from outside Europe is also correlated with racialized perceptions, right? That just made reviewers just furious. Just absolutely furious. I would justify it by basically saying, look, like the Syrians and other Middle Easterners that came in the 2014-15 crisis, like they're very obviously, connote poor from outside Europe. And you could actually make the claim irrespective. I mean, I'm not an expert in Eurasian studies or Eastern European politics or Slavic studies, but even though Ukrainians to folks in North America are sort of clearly white, like some Europeans might think of them as being poor from outside Europe, even if they're in the sort of nearby neighborhood. But anyway, that choice just made people furious. And so I got the comment repeatedly that what I should do is test it this way. And so I'm testing it this way and putting that other stuff in the appendix, because I agree with you. This is mostly trying to do everything, but make as few people as angry as possible so I can publish this thing. No, and I really love and appreciate that. But yeah, this is just another one of those moments which is really difficult. It's sort of again for the students in the room, when you're using data that already exists that you don't have control over, you have to make really difficult choices about what you're gonna do, and you just kind of gotta make one, defend it, and hope you get a good draw from the reviewer distribution, right? And the first couple of times I submitted this, I didn't. So fingers crossed for next time.
Okay, we have actually pertinent to this line of thinking, another question from the online audience. This is from Redwan Ahmed in Bangladesh. They introduce themselves and they say that they would like to ask whether the economic situation of a country plays a role in its willingness to accept refugees and if this acceptance changes over time. For example, in Bangladesh, their previous government made efforts to rehabilitate Rohingya refugees during a period of relative economic stability. And at that time, the public sentiment was generally welcoming. Redwan believes one reason for this was that the refugees were predominantly Muslim. However, now that their economic situation has worsened, the attitude towards the Rohingya has noticeably shifted, and people are less supportive. What is your opinion on this issue, particularly regarding the intersection of economic conditions and the treatment of refugees? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So so you're certainly correct. Like I certainly believe that countries that are experiencing negative economic shocks or periods of relative economic prosperity are going to have different responses for exactly the same reasons that the questioner raises. And that's why in the analysis, I try to control for these conditions somewhat, even though it's sort of an imperfect way of doing so. What I want to do is sort of say, controlling for these economic conditions, is it still the case that we see these racialized differences? And we still do. But I think this points to another really great opportunity to integrate the type of large-scale quantitative work that I do with case-specific work, like what the questioner suggests about the case of Bangladesh, because I think sort of a project that brings both of these together is particularly powerful because, as the questioner brings up, they think that there is still this effect of the perceptions due to religion or race, but that's colored, pun not intended, but sort of that's affected by the prevailing economic conditions on the ground. And so this is an opportunity, as sort of as Terry said, to talk about yes and. Both of these things can be true at the same time. And naturally, that's what makes studying this difficult, because you have to make these types of choices. I think this is why multi-method work is so great, because you can have your cake and eat it too.
Hi, Andrew. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the intersection of race and gender, which is something you haven't talked about. And people have often commented on the Ukrainian flow in terms of how female it is in children, given the proximity to Europe, but also the fact that men got conscripted and weren't allowed to leave. And so I would imagine that to impact public opinion. So
yeah,
could you control in any way for gender? Probably not. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and this is actually one of those things that I brought up with respect to the case selection limitations here. Like, there are very obvious differences between the 2015 and the 2022 cases, right? In the arrivals in 2022 were predominantly women and children, which certainly had an effect here. And so what we would want to do ideally is compare two cases that look as similar as possible and so on and so forth. But you asked about the intersection of gender and race, and that has come up as I've been thinking about this project for this exact reason. But is there a way to control for it? This is one benefit, I think, that the survey work has, the survey experimental work has, because, for instance, if you are looking at, if you're running a conjoint experiment and looking at the effect of different attributes of migrants and refugees on the willingness of a respondent to want to accept that person or not, you can look at the sort of independent effect of each of those things. So whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's religion. And so I think the fact that one or we can't sort of control for this intersectionality in these cases that we find out there in the world and study them in the way that I do here, it speaks for the need to do some of that work that I certainly don't do in this project. But I think that I want to end by sort of speculating on whether that may be driving the nulls. So a skeptic could make the argument that had the groups been similar, I may have seen like similar patterns in the 2015 and the 22 cases. However, maybe it was the fact that there were these striking differences in the arrivals between the two cases with respect to gender and with respect to age, say, that actually maybe sort of pushed those findings that we would have found if the pools were similar towards zero. But I'm just speculating. So it may be the case that this intersection was really divisive or really decisive or not. I'm not sure, and I can't really speak to that with the results that I have here. Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, I would point out that a lot of times this large scale N work leads to hypotheses that we can then look at in more detail and more qualitative approaches. But in any case, we've only got a few minutes left, so I want to take 2 or 3 questions. So are there any more? Okay, so we'll take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Anybody? So I see one there in the back and one up front.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your presentation. It's really fascinating. I'm 𝙍𝙚𝙚𝙬𝙚 a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. I have 2 questions. The first one, I think your message that racial bias is a global phenomenon is very powerful, but you are using cross-national data set. So I wonder whether you have explored the cross-national components a little bit more. Because in your analysis, you use country fixed effects. Have you wondered, for example, whether country level racial segregation or other dynamics may shape how racialized immigrants are perceived or welcomed in the country? And then my second question is related to the media consumption. I'm not familiar with the European context, but in the US, the media can be quite polarized. People reading Fox News or the Wall Street Journal can be very different from those reading New York Times or the Washington Post. So I wonder if you have if you are able to do any analysis relating to what kind of media or what types of media people are consuming. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Really nice to meet you. Your first point is super interesting about whether there is cross-national or even cross-time variation in the sorts of results that I'm finding here. And the short answer is yes. But I use the fixed effects models because I live in a world in particular where people are, sort of obsessed with, pushing bias towards zero, and random effects models, have this, they sort of allow us to use variation in order to look at these types of things. And so separately, I have looked at variation across space and across time, and there is really important variation in both scores. The first, across time, we see that this effect gets stronger over time, which is really interesting, I think. In particular, it gets stronger after 9/11. So it could be the case that this is related to the sort of increased racialization and securitization of migration in the global north that we have seen since this period. And there is also interesting variation across space, but I haven't looked at that variation recently enough to be able to tell you something specific about it. But I think that your intuition is really right, because this analysis is really ripe for looking at variation in order to maybe, as Terry brought up, look at specific cases where particularly interesting examples of this are going on. So thank you for that question. Your second question about the US media being very polarized, and I don't know, it must be the case that media is polarized everywhere, right? But you're exactly right. And is it possible to do an analysis that takes into account, different types of media or different sources, something like that? In this case, no. I'm really limited in the questions that were asked on the ESS, but in related work that looks at the related work that I talked about that involves the county level US refugee admission data. So what I'm thinking about is taking advantage of this somewhat and looking at, again, whether or not that county is in a media market that has been captured by Sinclair, which is the right-wing sort of conglomerate, and interacting that with a respondent's party identification to see whether its consumption of right-wing media interacted with a partisan affiliation, whether that moderates the effect of migrants or I guess refugees from the global south on attitude. So I haven't done that yet, but I've been that's sort of on the, not the back burner, not the front burner, but sort of the middle burner, precisely because of this reason that you bring up. So thank you very much for, again, pushing me in this direction, because I think it's a really important concern.
We have a question right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sydney Martin. I'm an undergrad at UBC studying political science. And I also have a two-part question. The first part is related to media. And I was wondering whether in your current or your past studies or any future studies, you considered looking at social media, since especially in relation to looking at echo chambers and polarization and bias, there often can be a lot of that on social media on different sources where people are increasingly getting their information from TikTok, from Instagram, and from even just individual creators with no necessarily news experience who they just like to follow. And then kind of related to that, I was also wondering your thoughts on the crisis discourse when looking or using crisis as a term when looking at the refugee crises of Ukraine or Syria, since it isn't a neutral term and often is weaponized to kind of to be against migration or against refugees. So kind of how you tackle that in your own work. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy. So the first question about looking at social media because of the echo chambers that are related to the sources, this is a super important concern, and it's also sort of speaks to a limitation of what I do in this analysis. The paper's great, I promise, but I guess but there are a lot of really important limitations, and the first is that the moderator here is political news, political TV news consumption. Do you ever watch political TV news? No, of course not, right? And so what I would love is to be able to replicate aspects of this analysis looking at the impact of social media. So the Twitter API has been restricted, and so I'm not sure how to go about doing that, but I think you're exactly right. And this probably means that the results here, at least for 2022, probably not for 2015, but at least 2022, are sort of a little bit murkier because of the predominance of social media. But with respect to the echo chambers thing, I think you're exactly right. And I don't know how to deal with that. I think it's a separate study, but it's a study that can build on the findings here. And so I need to think more about that. And the second question about the crisis discourse, I know we're running out of time. Again, this is related to me thinking about Rebecca Hamlin's work and the use of the term refugee, like we talked about earlier. Refugee, crisis, flows, all of these terms that have politicized connotations. I think about this type of language use and word choice in my work all the time, just not only because of my own positionality, but because of the really political impact of the words that we use. And so that's why I try to use the scare quotes, and I try to be very clear in the work that I'm doing, what the limitations and the political implications of that are. But you raise an important question that is, I think, salient for basically anybody who works not just in this area, but in a variety of areas of political and social sciences. We're dealing with marginalized groups who are subject to this type of politicization of the labels that we use around them. So thank you so much for those two questions. I think they were great. Thanks.
All right, I think we can wrap up here. So thank you so much. It's been great. Thanks to everybody for the great questions and comments and challenges. This is very challenging work, partly because if you can't tell, Andrew's really breaking new ground. And the reason why we can't get the data, which I've been frustrated about for about 25 years, is because the surveys just don't serve the kind of work we're doing. And so that's my next goal, is to hopefully develop a project that will allow us to do the kind of survey data analysis that would be much more relevant versus just relying on these broad social surveys. But in any case, another really, I think, important component that comes out of this is how do we define these things? And one of my first probably edited volumes out of this project is going to be how do we define this? And, what is race? What is immigration? What does it mean to be a refugee? And how does that come across in different contexts? I mean, what it means, race means in Asia, different Asian countries has a very different connotation as compared to Europe, as compared to Africa, et cetera. So anyway, I hope you will keep watching this this project and what's happening at CMS. And I just want to announce some upcoming events and again, thank you to the folks who are online as well. We have the CMS Community Luncheon being hosted on September 24th. And then our second speaker series talk will be held on October 28th. Another friend of mine, Jean Beeman, who does work on immigration politics in France. And then please subscribe to the CMS mailing list and keep an eye out on the CMS website for more information on all of these things. Again, thank you for coming, and thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.